Hi, folks. This is Dr. Rob CYWES. I am the carb addiction doc, and I have the enormous privilege of meeting strangers who blew my mind away. I was sent a book which is titled very benignly, Why Vegans Have Smaller Brains and How Cows Reverse Climate Change. And the authors are David Ellis, Alison Morgan, and Anita Tagore. I think I'm saying that correctly, am I?
Yes.
And what gives us credibility already is all five of us have an accent. So we get credibility for our accent already. But briefly, I don't know any of you at all from a background perspective and from a science-based perspective. All too often in this space, people tell their own story and that gives them legitimacy to give advice. And I'm always skeptical a little bit of that. We've all got our own personal story to tell. But with a book like this, and I think the statement I want to make is that this book is not a criticism of a vegan diet or of a particular diet. You really do a wonderful job of outlining and setting out facts and process and history and futuristic endeavors that are fact-based, which makes this so difficult for other folks, for the vegan group to argue about emotively. We've all been engaged in discussions, and the dominant thing that I notice is emotive arguments and personalization. This book doesn't do that. But could you introduce yourselves and tell us where you came from and how you got to do this this book?
Hi, Rob. I'm Anita Tagore. I'm a retired medical doctor. I qualified from the University of Cambridge in the 1980s. I did a master's in food and human nutrition more recently. In the last few years, I've been working on this book, and I've also taken up regenerative livestock farming on a farm in England.
Great. Dave or
go ahead, Ali.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. I'm Alison Morgan. I'm an agriculturalist and specialist in the impacts of farming on the environment. I've worked in agricultural advice and research and policy for over 40 years in various parts of Britain and also in Central Asia and the Middle East. And so my contribution to the book has been on the farming and environment side of things.
Excellent. It's great to meet you. Dave, yes.
Yeah. So I'm Dave Ellis. I graduated in geology from the University of Cambridge, but spent all of my career, over 30 years, as a geophysicist working for oil companies.
What is that?
So we're looking for oil and gas.
Looking for oil and gas.
Making images of the earth, of what's underneath, to look for oil and gas. I describe myself as a phrase that some people haven't understood, poacher turned gamekeeper, by which I mean when I was a poacher, I was producing the stuff that we are blaming for climate change and so on. Now I'm really interested on the other side of the fence as to the way farming can actually reduce climate change and reduce the amount of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere.
Great, excellent. Well, it's good to meet all three of you, and all three of you bring something different to the table. Anita, let me start with you, and I'm going to ask two questions. The first one is, how is there, or how did you resolve the conflict between what you were taught? You mentioned that you've got nutritional education, which I'm assuming is a standard RDA.
Yes.
Post-1970, really in the US, post-1977 nutritional approach. How do you reconcile your training with where you currently are? And if I may, personally, what is your origin? What is your religious and family origin?
I'm originally from India. I was born in India. I was brought up as a Hindu.
Okay, because obviously the reason I mention that is because in my patient population, I have a number of Hindu Indians, and there's a religious component to at least vegetarianism. And so let's do a deep dive into both of those, the conflict educationally, and then the conflict or how you resolve the religious aspect of people who are religiously vegetarian?
So I've actually looked up the origins of the vegetarianism and not eating beef for Hindus. And if you go back far enough into the ancient Sanskrit writings, the Hindu gods and the Brahmins in India actually used to eat beef. It's a more, well, relatively recent, in the last couple of thousand years, that the Hindu religion has adopted this no beef idea, and that it's better to be vegetarian. So strictly speaking, I'd say there isn't a conflict with the Hindu religion.
But if you are Hindu and you don't look at the ancestry and the history, you say this is the current doctrine. How do you reconcile a vegetarian diet within the current religious format and what you're saying in this book, both sustainably for the earth, and obviously we're dealing with a very large Hindu population in India, largest, I believe the largest volume of people in the world right now. And not everybody's Hindu, but a very large population who are not willing to change. How do you manage that agriculturally as well as conceptually, locked into who they are right now?
Well, I'll let Ali talk about the agriculture side of things later, but conceptually, I would say that if you're following the diet for ethical or moral reasons, that a plant-based diet actually involves more and more death and more inhumane death in farming than eating meat does. And I'm assuming that the religious reasons for following a vegetarian diet are for those ethical reasons, so they don't really hold up.
Right. So one of the approaches I personally use, and again, it depends on how fundamental the religious beliefs are. And we've not just got the Hindus, we've got Seventh-day Adventists, other folks, but I use also a kind of middle ground concept nutritionally, which is sustainable animal products, which is eggs and dairy. And it's a way that I can at least introduce certain animal products, whether you've got the antagonism to the death of animals, which we'll get to in a few minutes, but whatever that antagonism is, that's one of the ways that I try to navigate people, because it's difficult in the clinical practice to tell people that their beliefs are wrong in terms of religion. And so we've got to navigate, how do we optimize their diet without major conflict to their belief system?
I wouldn't tell anybody, I wouldn't challenge people's beliefs. My aim is to provide correct information, and people can do what they like with that information. A vegan diet is deficient in many minerals and vitamins. People who are vegetarian or vegan would say, but they can supplement. So they've always got that comeback.
I think it goes wider than just your religious beliefs. You know, the conversations we've had with people, it's when you have this conversation about, you know, what are you eating and should you change it? It's almost like you're challenging their identity, their family history, their social history, and so on, whether that involves religion or not. And you know, we've explained what we've been talking about in the book to people. They understand logically, they understand it, but will they change the way they eat? Well, not there and then, for sure. It's a long conversation to try and convince people.
Right, and typically the benefit for me is, the reason I see people as a physician is not because they're well, usually. Some people are well, want to do better, but the majority of my committed vegetarians are seeing me because they're ill, because they have either obesity, diabetes, or some form of disease, and then they have to create the internal conflict. Do I want to resolve my disease, or how locked into the religious aspects am I? And that's where the conflict with blue zones and other things comes in, is that they're not as healthy as they should be. Ali, you go by Ali or Alison, which do you prefer?
Ali.
Ali, okay.
Yeah.
Ali, the way I look at at vegetarians, I kind of classify vegetarianism or veganism into three different categories. The first one, which are in my opinion, obviously the worst ones in terms of health and disease, are what I call junk food vegans, where they're eating a variety of fast foods. They're avoiding animal products, but it's a bunch of garbage, a bunch of seed oils, a bunch of processed carbohydrates. Then one level up from that is what I call the white vegans or vegetarians, which are predominantly eating the white starches, the rices, the potatoes, the pastas, somewhat processed, but somewhat straight from the earth, minorly processed, but dominantly starch foods. And then I've got the green vegetarians who are primarily eating leafy green vegetables. They're very particular about sourcing their food and mixing their food up so that they get their proteins, certain fats from those foods. And the green vegetarians, who are rare because they've eliminated a dominant concern for me, which I have to bring in, which is the addictive nature of carbohydrates. Obviously that's my brand and that's my focus, but the green vegetarians are usually pretty darn healthy. So from an agricultural perspective and from a food processing perspective, which gives us food for the masses, let's not talk about the animal product side, purely on the vegan vegetarian side, how do we sustainably even grow enough crops that are leafy green as opposed to white or junk?
Well, I would question, so for many people, if they're green vegetarians or vegan, it is almost who are not from a vegan from a Hindu background or another religious background, it has almost become a religion to believe that meat is unethical, and I would challenge that by saying that actually pasture-reared meat, so that's cattle and sheep and other animals, is actually the most ethical food that we can eat. In terms of growing vegetables and arable crops, these are all quite damaging to the environment. I think what most people don't realize is that we have changed our agriculture drastically within the last 100 years. And agriculture itself isn't a very long-term thing. Only in the last 10,000 years have we been eating agricultural diets. But within the last 100 years, we've had a massive transformation in how we produce arable crops and vegetable crops. And we have decoupled it from livestock production. So historically, we've lost our memories about this. Farmers and people historically always understood that arable farming, whether that's for grains or whether it's for vegetable crops, depletes the soil. It damages the soil and depletes the soil. And it causes soil damage. It also eradicates the habitat and harms animal life in that area. Whereas livestock farming, grazing livestock, actually restores the soil and restores habitat and supports habitat. So historically, if you go back 100 years ago in Britain or most parts of the world, you had mixed farming. So in areas where you could grow arable crops, which isn't everywhere, in fact, it's only about 1/3 of the agricultural land in the world, the traditional way of doing that was to grow a couple of years of arable crops or vegetable crops, and then you put grass back in for between 1 and 5 years and grazed it with cattle or sheep or other livestock. And that restored the damage that the arable farming had caused to the soil. And it puts carbon back into the soil, organic matter, from the dung of the animal, from the roots of the grass. And it prevents soil erosion. And also it means that the arable crop is not dependent on agrochemicals like pesticides, at least not to the same degree. And of course, it's, 100 years or so ago, we didn't have pesticides and we didn't have artificial fertilizers. So the way to grow arable crops and vegetable crops was to put organic manure from animals into the land and to graze it with grass and put a mixed sward of grass and legumes like clover and graze that with sheep. So that's what we've forgotten about. And, lots of people talk about, oh, they always buy organic vegetables. Well, I would really question that for a start, because hardly any of our land is organic for arable crops and vegetable crops, less than 2% in this country and in most parts of the industrialized world. Most of the land is grown with agrochemicals because it's been separated from grass and livestock. But organic production and regenerative production of any crops relies on having grass and animals, grazing animals in there. So that is the most ethical way to produce crops. So you cannot have vegan farming. There's no such possibility, because it damages the soil, and we're losing vast amounts of our topsoils. If you look in the United States, in the central grasslands of the United States, which have been converted from grasslands to arable cropping so drastically, they've lost 3/4 of their topsoil in those areas. And also terrible impacts on wildlife, bird species, and other wildlife, our insect life and so on. So it's actually very important to have grazing livestock mixed with arable farming if you want to eat vegetables and arable crops.
So you're arguing that cycling, or you're saying that cycling crops and animal food, an animal foundation to the land at various times is a reasonable compromise, that it's not just animals or just crops, but if you cycle, you are regenerating and restoring the natural.
Unfortunately, we've in the last 80 or 100 years, since the Second World War onwards, when we got agrochemicals, our landscape for farming has drastically changed. So in the east of England, where I worked for a number of years, you've got continuous arable cropping, wheat, barley, vegetables, oilseeds, all these crops, sugar beet, all these crops just one after another, with no animals in sight. The animals are on the marginal land around the edge, and that goes for many areas of the world these days. And it's actually going to be very hard to go back from that, but that's what we need to do. We need to go back, and it's very hard because we've adapted an agricultural method that is like big fields, no fences, no hedges or trees. They were all ripped out to provide for arable farming, whereas livestock, you need fences or hedges and grassland, and that's inconvenient for the big machinery, agrochemical-based farming enterprises.
Right, and I think one of the other, I appreciate what you have to say there. One of the other comments that I didn't see in the book, but something that I focus on very heavily, is the hybridization of plants, especially grown commercially, in that the majority of plants that are currently available and served in our large grocery stores did not exist when I was born.
Yeah.
And I'm old, but I'm not that old. So hybridization has transformed things. And when you talk about pressure on the land, hybridization has increased crop yield, increased crop density, increased the safety of the crops. But when you increase crop density on a particular part of the land, that crop still has to get everything through its roots. So the extraction of adequate minerals, vitamins, whatever it may be, from the soil is far more dense per square foot or square meter, based upon the density of the foods that we consume. It was interesting. I was in Stratford last year. I spoke in Oxford, and we went into the countryside, and everywhere, everybody's farming Brussels sprouts. And when I was growing up, Brussels sprouts were disgusting. But in 1999, a Belgian botanist removed the bitterness gene out of the Brussels sprouts. Now everybody's growing Brussels sprouts, and it's become this wonderful thing that people eat with relish, not the plant relish, but with enjoyment. And yet that food product is less than 25 years old in terms of a crop. You know, same thing with potatoes in the Irish. Christopher Columbus brought the potatoes across in 1500, and then we have this Irish famine where the potato crop fails a century or two after that. It shows you how dependent we've become on these crops. Dave, let me ask you a question, though. You were a poacher by definition before. And along the same lines, when you look at food that you poached, I'm assuming you didn't poach sheep and cows from the farmer next door's lands. I'm assuming
I didn't.
it was wild animals that you were poaching.
Yeah, let me be clear. That's a turn of phrase. I've never shot an animal in my life. So I was a poacher in that I was producing oil and gas that we all use and we all burn, that puts carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. So I was on that side of the fence, the poacher side of the fence. I've now switched since I've retired from that job many years, well, about eight, 9 years ago. Now I call myself a gamekeeper, in which case I'm trying to look after the environment rather than damage it. And one of the ways that I'm now, and this is obviously in the book, in Ali's chapters, one of the ways of looking after the planet is to draw down carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, reduce the amount of greenhouse gases that we've been putting there. And it's interesting, one of the facts I learned from Ali, and it's quoted in the book, is that we think that a third, we talk about the increase in carbon dioxide in the atmosphere over the last 100, 200 years, and it's been dramatic. And people then start talking about, is it to do with burning fossil fuels? But there are studies out there that say 1/3 of that increase has come from the release of carbon from soils in the way that Ali's described, the way that arable farming damages soil. Every time you disturb the soil by ploughing or from harvesting, uprooting crops, you expose soil that's been buried. It's now exposed to the air. The carbon content in that soil can then oxidize into carbon dioxide. 1/3 of the carbon dioxide, the increase in carbon dioxide over the last 100, 200 years has come from farming, and it's come from crop farming. So this is, the interest is that, I'm fascinated now. I never realized that the soil, all the soil of the earth contains more, or should contain more carbon than the atmosphere, than all the animals, than all the vegetation that lives on that soil. It's only smaller than the carbon that's held in the oceans. It's the largest store of terrestrial carbon, and we're releasing it. And yet
the most valuable. Sorry, I was just going to chip in there, Dave.
Yeah, the media narrative almost completely ignores this, doesn't even recognize that it exists. And of course, the media narrative is about cows and methane.
Right, but let me ask
they
you
get
this,
it completely wrong.
If we're talking about cows and methane or methane, and we're talking about agriculture extracting carbon from the soil, is that not the pimple on the elephant's ass when it comes to fossil fuel? I mean, fossil fuels are carbon. Fossil fuels are dead plants for the most part. Those have been buried from historical plants that weren't used by animals, that were buried under the soil. The earth has a particular volume of carbon, some of it buried. Surely the agricultural aspect is a tiny fraction of what we are releasing with fossil fuels.
I'll let Ali talk about this. It's that 1/3 figure that I find shocking. Yeah. I'll let Ali talk about it.
You're right in that the emissions from fossil fuel burning, because that's part of the slow carbon cycle, So we can't put that back quickly enough. So the volumes of fossil fuels that we're burning must be contributing a huge amount. But yes, so there are papers, studies showing that a third of the carbon that we've added to the atmosphere has come from damage to the soil. And most of that damage has been caused by arable cropping, whereas grassland and grazing livestock put the carbon back into the soil. So they reverse that. And one of the things that we talk about in the book is, as Dave said, the soil is the biggest terrestrial store of carbon. And it's, in particular, the most valuable soils are peat soils and grassland soils. The amount of peat in the world is diminishing and is fairly small, but grassland soils cover a huge proportion of the earth. So they're really important, and it's really important to conserve those grasslands and look after them and to keep them being grazed, sometimes with historically, for instance, in the Central American grasslands, it was bison and elk, and now it's cattle. And those cattle are really important to restore the carbon into the soil. So
I think it's worth quickly mentioning also that people's main concern with cows is the methane and the net effect of livestock farming on pastures or regeneratively is carbon sequestration, even taking the methane emissions into account.
Yeah,
so
I think that's become more of an emotive argument, because clearly, logically, it holds no water. I mean, it really is a logical
It certainly doesn't, Rob. The methane degrades relatively quick. It's part of a faster cycle of carbon. All that cows and pasture are doing are recirculating carbon. From carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere by photosynthesis, the plant grows, building itself up with carbohydrate, the cow eats it. A fraction of that comes back out as methane, but the methane breaks down back into the original carbon dioxide, and that goes round and round.
And there's actually a net, because the some of that carbon dioxide that the plant took out of the atmosphere and turned into carbohydrates gets secreted into the soil by the grassland plants as sugars. And as you're not disturbing grassland soils, because grass is a perennial plant and the other plants in grasslands are perennials and they just remain the whole time. So you are building up carbon from the roots of those plants and also from the dung from the animals. And that the way that you may have heard of Alan Savory, the Zimbabwean ecologist who's done some fantastic work, developed the idea of holistic planned grazing, because the grazing animals, cattle or wild animals, when they graze as a tight mob and move around quickly, they are pushing carbon into the soil with their hooves, with their dung, and they're restoring the soil. And so long as you manage that grazing properly with this method of moving quickly and not coming back too early. So actually grazing animals are really beneficial for carbon sequestration. And we know studies have been done in Europe with the goat and sheep population showing that actually they're, at worst, they are carbon neutral. And if you apply the new systems that are being recommended for global warming potential calculations about the impacts of methane that are being recommended by Oxford climate scientists like Miles Allen, if you apply that thinking, then there is a net transfer of carbon into the soil. So the methane is not additional. The methane that the ruminants are belching out is not additional methane, and so there's a net benefit in terms of carbon sequestration.
I
the
think just to
mainstream, the
go ahead.
mainstream media, Rob, in the UK, or probably all over the world, don't understand this. The
Well, absolutely. I
BBC,
think one of the other problems I have is that when we talk about animals and methane and carbon transformation and cow poop and all, we tend to absolve 8 billion people of doing the same. And you know, a large part of whether you're consuming meat or whether you're consuming plants, we are returning that back to the earth somehow.
exactly.
When our bodies get buried, unless we burn them, or when we poop, when we fart, when we create methane, we are as much part of the animal ecosystem as all the
Yeah.
cows and all the sheep and everybody else. And so I think all of that just challenges some of the uh, misconceptions of plants versus animals. And I think there is, I'm going to say this, and this is maybe a bit blasphemous to this book, but there is a happy medium. And I think the pendulum has swung too far to one side, and it can swing back to the middle in terms of how we conceptualize planet Earth. But I think there's something that is more important in terms of making decisions about what we eat. And I want to make a little pivot here, and that is how the human body optimally, or what nutrition the human body optimally requires. And we started with the back part of the book, which is really the agricultural side, the regenerative farming side, which I think is crucially important as we navigate an increasing population that I've heard is going to top out at 11 to 12 billion. If we are going to be more animal based, we have to figure out how we handle those crops, and I'll return back how we handle those animal production. However, I want to turn to something that is more important probably as we figure out what is the optimum human diet. And one of the conflicts that we have, and I think Ali, you'll agree with this, we currently live globally, despite famine, despite starvation in certain areas, the majority of people live in an era of ridiculous, obscene abundance of food. Um, However, the quality of that food may be a concern in terms of biologically what we think is best or what we know is best for the human body versus what is best for the planet and everything else. Anita, this book, let's go back to the title, Why Vegans Have Smaller Brains. As a physician, can we talk about embryology, about brain anatomy, and how important the development and the embryology of the brain is from the 6-week mark where the brain first starts to form through the first 5 years of life, and why that is crucial to us as a species that is now living 75 to 80 years from that time?
It's well recognized that the first 3 years of life, from conception to the age of 2, are critical for brain growth and development. The WHO has come up with the term first 1,000 days to address this time, and they look at the nutrition in pregnant women and infants to make sure that they can get the best possible nutrition. They also recognize that meat is essential and provides the nutrients that are needed for brain growth. And most importantly, if you don't get the right nutrition at this time, you don't always fulfill your cognitive potential. So it's absolutely critical to get the right nutrition in the first few years of life. Otherwise, it's irreversible, the damage that's done by not having the right nutrition.
And one of the things that I battle with a lot is walking this forward versus walking it backward. What a lot of people, the majority of people, will define something as being healthy or not by a label. So they'll say, oh, fruit is healthy, or oh, in our case, steak is healthy. And then if you walk that forward through the consumption, through the intestinal breakdown, through the liver metabolism to arrival at the organs, there's a massive transformation of that product. What I prefer to do is to walk it backwards. So let's take that first 1,000 days. Let's take the human brain. what are the requirements for the healthiest brain development structurally and nutritionally? And let's walk that back to food source.
Yes, so newborn babies, their brain uses up 70% of their total energy intake. In adults, it's about 20%. Either way, it's a phenomenal amount of energy. So yes, you do need the calories, but you also need the right nutrients. All the vitamins and minerals are important, but especially vitamins like vitamin B12, and there's a fatty acid, an omega-3 fat called DHA, which are you can't get from a plant-based diet. And those are the reasons why you have to include some animal foods in your diet to provide those correct nutrients for normal brain growth.
Well, let me break this down, because I think another arbitrary and false distinction that we make, which the human body does not do, is to separate out caloric value, which is energy, and nutrients. The two are the same, and the human body switches some pathways on and off with a priority toward energy provision, and the human body will steal to create that energy. But in a newborn, in a developing baby, in a child's brain that develops rapidly for the first 5 years of life, it's predominantly about the building blocks of that brain. The caloric value, the energy value needs to be provided. But in the modern era, unless you're in South Sudan or somewhere where you don't have adequate caloric value, we have an abundance of calories in all diets. The question is the components of that diet to develop the structural, or to allow the structure of the brain to develop most adequately. And the primary requirement by the brain, as you mentioned, is not just the essential fats, but also generally the fat. The human brain is 65 to 70% fat. Can that come from a vegetarian dominant diet, or must that have, for adequate brain development, must that have a source of animal fats?
It must have a source of animal fat and animal foods that provide the other key nutrients. Absolutely. The other thing about babies is that they go into ketosis easily. And out of all the primates, human babies have the highest amounts of fat. And one of the theories is that being able to go into ketosis and use ketones for our brains as a fuel is what helped our brains grow in evolution.
Well, again, I think when you mention ketones, that is for me the single biggest argument against the division of nutrients versus calories, in that ketones are building blocks, they're bricks. And ketones very rapidly enter the brain, cross the blood-brain barrier. They can be used for energy, which is the focus, the assumption. But ketones are also a wonderful building block for more complex fats that are required by the human body. Sugar can be converted to fat, but the quality of those C16, C18 fats are very unstable. The way I look at it is like the three little pigs' houses. You can build your brain of sticks, or you can build your brain of straw. But when you build it of bricks and concrete and cement, you have a good brain. So I think the first aspect there is the provision of adequate nutrients. But the second thing that I also focus on is, even though the human body, the gut, the liver can convert carbohydrates to fat, the hormones that are required to do that, when they're in excess, or when there's an imbalance in the homeostatic pathway, when the trend is toward one side, that creates disease entities, hyperglycemia, diabetes, gestational diabetes. So it's not just the provision of the substrate, it's also the alteration in that normal hormonal homeostasis that affects brain development in the child, particularly in utero, but then even afterwards. Would you care to comment on the massive rise of gestational diabetes and of metabolic diseases that impact brain function and brain growth and brain development, as well as on the other side of the spectrum, senescence and the massive increase in Alzheimer's and cognitive impairment on the back end of our lives.
In the book, we suggest that the massive rise in metabolic disease in the last 40 to 50 years is because of the change in the food guidelines. The food guidelines recommend an enormous amount of carbohydrates in our diet from whole grains, fruit, and vegetables. That's roughly 70% of our diet now. And we think that's completely wrong. And the majority of our calories should come from fat, animal fat instead. So, well, you probably know all this very well, but it's the carbohydrates that cause insulin to go up. Abnormally high insulin levels are at the root cause of most Western metabolic diseases. So the way to correct that is to change your diet.
And I think the other part also is that the evidence of structural abnormalities and hormonal abnormalities are evidenced early on in our children as ADHD, as attention deficit, hyperactivity disorder, all the way through to the autism spectrum disorder, which is really a structural problem with the brain. And yet our society still considers autism to be a purely behavioral diagnostic thing. You can, on an MRI at 3 months of age, determine whether the structure of a child's brain is abnormal enough to result in autism. But the diagnosis is only made around the age of 8 because of behavioral elements.
I actually didn't know that there are structural changes that early, which suggest autism later.
Yeah, it's the structure of the brain based on what you've just talked about, which is the substrate and the hormonal regulation.
Yes.
So Dave, since you are the fuel guy, you are the energy guy, how, and this is kind of in that realm, how does heating up our food, how does cooking our food, whether it's vegetables or animal products, how does that, because we are the only species that heats up our food. How does heating our food affect positively or negatively the foods that we're eating? And also the gut biome, that hot food, how does that transformation of food that makes it more palatable, but how does it affect us positively or negatively?
Well, so what I understand is that we, so as we evolved, when we split from the chimpanzee line 6 million years ago, and we evolved through into Homo sapiens around 200, 300,000 years ago. First of all, we scavenged for food, and that was an easy win. We didn't have to do any hunting, we could scavenge, and that's where we developed our taste for meat, for liver, for offals, for fat. And that initiated brain growth. And then we became more intelligent, we started hunting, and we didn't have to rely on scavenging or kill sites. So we had this circle where we became more intelligent because we were eating foods rich in the vitamins and fats needed by the brain.
Well, let me stop you for a second, just as I want you to continue but that's a very important point you make in the diet. We didn't evolve to eat meat. This is a statement from the book. We evolved because we ate meat.
Yes.
And that is just such an important concept. And I want to get into evolution a little bit, but let's talk about heating food.
So then at some point we started cooking. So these animal foods are easily digested. The physiology the makeup of our intestines evolved as well as our brain evolving. Our intestines were evolving, becoming more efficient because they were eating nutrient-dense food, animal products. But one of the other ways in which we made the food even easier to digest was by cooking. So by heating the meat, it makes it's easier to break down in the gut, easier to release the nutrients, and so it made it And also, of course,
easier to chew,
and of course, tended to kill any infections, any bacteria or anything living on the meat. So cooking of meat and animal products further helped this ease of nutrition and enabled the progress of us into Homo sapiens. It's interesting as well, of course, that since the agricultural revolution, 10,000 years ago, many of the, and we've touched on this earlier, you talked about hybrid varieties of vegetables and so on. We've been doing that for thousands of years, selectively taking the plants that we grow and selecting those, again, that are easier to digest, because originally those plants, those vegetables would not have been easy to digest.
It's worth
which is an argument as well. That's from our historical record suggests, why would we have relied on those? If those are our natural foods, plants, well, how could they have been? They weren't that digestible. They weren't that nutrient rich.
It's worth just pointing out at this point that by the time man could reliably control fire, which is roughly 300,000 years ago, the brain growth had already happened to its maximum size. So cooking food probably didn't contribute to at least the growth in volume of the human brain. Some argue that it has made a difference, and it was cooking root vegetables that led to the growth of the human brain. But it's by the time the human brain had reached its maximum size, that was roughly when we started being able to control fire for cooking.
Yeah, no, it's interesting because one of the comments that the vegetarian dominant population makes is, well, let's look at the dental record. Human beings no longer have the teeth of carnivores to be able to rip meat apart. All carnivores have, I've still got them, big eye, I'm a throwback, big eye teeth, foods that can rip and then grind the food. And our dentition has, in the record, gone backwards. So you talk about fire being available 300,000 years ago. Is that 300,000 plus years, or whatever the time frame is when we started cooking our food and boiling our vegetables and processing our meat and our food a little bit through fire, is that 300,000 plus years adequate to transform our dentition, to change how the dental record and the need for the large, strong facial muscles to be able to rip food apart and that kind of thing? And I'll give you a little anecdote about that. My son has been a carnivore since he was a sperm and an egg. And he has the most incredible dentition, and he has the most incredible facial muscles with a long chin leveling, just really the structure. He's 4 years old. And that's primarily because he's been fed meat since he was 4 months old. And that ability to chew and eat has altered his facial structure from a lot of his peers. So even though we don't see the big eye teeth and the other things, we've seen that positively, but we do heat our food up. What do you, because I've got another evolutionary question to ask. So do you think that's adequate, that 300,000 plus years adequate to change the shape of our mouths?
I don't know actually about that.
But there is a general criticism.
But from an evolutionary point of view, we cut out the middleman and we didn't need the fangs because we had tools to cut meat.
Okay, yes, you're right. So we have the tools
even
and
though
the
we
cooking.
didn't have
Correct.
the dentition of carnivorous animals,
but
we didn't need it.
What time frame are we talking about?
Ever since we were able to make and use tools, we haven't needed the teeth of carnivorous animals.
And going right back to when we started scavenging from kill sites, because using stones to break open skulls and get at the brain.
The very first meats that our hominin ancestors ate, Australopithecus, were brain and bone marrow, which are soft and don't need the dentition of carnivorous animals.
The
And
reason
when
I
it comes
ask is because going forward, if we do stay with a vegetarian vegan diet, how long do we need evolutionarily to be able to extract adequate nutrition from plants, assuming we have to go that way, or to manufactured foods? How rapidly can we evolve to benefit from that? Or is this a branch that's going to go extinct in our
Well, we
evolutionary
worry.
tree?
We worry. I mean, the human brain grew, but its max. The measurements suggest it reached its maximum size around 10,000 years ago, 1350 cubic centimeters. And for some reason, in the last 10,000 years, it's shrunk, and it's now around 1260. So we've lost about 7% of brain volume. People seem to, various theories, to do with change of social structure, the way we interact with people has changed in those 10,000 years. The growing use of technology, of course, has changed in 10,000 years. But of course, the other thing that's changed is diet. Now, if it was due to diet and a reduction in the amount of animal source foods that we eat and an increase in the amount of plant source food we eat, if that is the case, then we've seen a change in 10,000 years, and the change is in one direction. So it's an interesting question you ask. Could we adapt to a plant-based diet in a way that sustains our health and sustains our brain? I think we'd question that.
Right, and I think in
you
an
would have
era
to
of
ask a
go ahead.
geneticist. I wouldn't know the timeline for how long it would take to adapt to a
Right,
plant.
and I think that we've all said that it's based upon other structural aspects. It's much longer than the short period of time that we've had. But there is, Dave, this conflict between currently having the most stable, reliable, abundant food, global, general food resource, more so than we've ever had before. We come from a background of relative food scarcity where food acquisition was more important than food selection. Now we live in that abundant era where we are able to select food. I mean, we have survived lean times, not because we ate a lot of meat, but because we lived on some of the high starch plant-based foods. And
that's not entirely true, though. That's not entirely true, because with agricultural diets, we've actually had to increase how much work we do, so that we're if you're a farmer in a society that's highly dependent on grains and crops, not only are you less healthy, you're having to put more hours of work in. The problem was that it's hard to go back from that. So hunter-gatherers, or people who are mainly hunting and eating meat, actually put in fewer hours of work to get their nutrition, and the quality of that nutrition is better. Just going back to the eating of plant foods historically, remember that we basically evolved in the open grasslands of Africa, where the main food source was large herbivores, meat and animal fat. Those animals are very fatty. So there wouldn't have been huge amounts of fruit or vegetable. There certainly wouldn't have been vegetables around that we could eat, because most of the vegetative parts of plants naturally contain phytotoxins, because the plant doesn't want us to eat those parts. It might want us to eat those, to eat its fruit in order to disperse its seeds, but we'd have been competing with monkeys for those fruits and things. So with meat being much more nutrient dense, we evolved in that direction. And in terms of agricultural societies, where you are, as you say, there's this abundance of food, but then you have years of famine and destruction by plagues of locusts and this kind of thing, in which there's massive loss of life. And also what that kind of agricultural transition did was it enabled people to grow, to live long enough to reproduce, but not to live healthily into later life. We reproduce quite young, and it enabled people to live that long and to reproduce. So population exploded with agricultural diets, but that doesn't actually correlate with good health in life overall.
Yeah, what's interesting when you make that argument, Ali, and I do want to shift to something else that's very important in this book, but the quintessential food, the only food that all mammals can rely on 100% is breast milk. And because it's the only food, without breast milk, no mammal survives, whether you're a beluga whale, an elephant, or a human, except for the modification of what I call baby milkshakes, which are now which is a ludicrous, not for this, the baby formula market. But if we look at breast milk, the female breast optimizes the quality of that breast milk irrespective of what the mother eats. It'll parasitize the mother, either the stores she has within her own muscles to provide adequate protein, her own fat, or rely on the diet of the mother. And I think there are periods in our evolution where, particularly women, because they were breastfeeding, sacrificed their own health to provide for the next generation, which shortened the lives of those women. But I think as we are intent on living longer through menopause into our 70s and 80s, the majority of the nutrition that a feeding mother should come from her mouth into her breast tissue, into the uterus to provide for that baby, rather than the baby parasitizing what's already inside of that mother, if that makes sense. It's just, I just want to put that comment out there. But I want to segue to something else that's dominant in this book. And I understand it in terms of the Latin, but it is, for a lot of people, a difficult concept to understand. First of all, dual question for all three of you. What is a sapiens diet, and why the heck do we have to create a new diet?
So the sapiens diet is a diet that's based on animal fat, meat, and offal. In its strictest form, it has just those foods. Although if you don't suffer from a serious illness, we suggest an optional small amount of fruit and vegetables. We call it the sapiens diet, although it's actually a type of ketogenic diet, which is also Paleolithic. It's based on the research of a group in Hungary who came up with this term, the Paleo-Keto diet. They have been using it to treat severe diseases in their patients for the last 10 to 15 years, very successfully. And that's what the sapiens diet is based on. It's not a new diet, it's the diet we've evolved eating, and that's why we've called it the sapiens diet.
I think here's a little bit of an argument for you, is that the word vegetarian, the word vegan has existed, I'm not sure exactly how long, but for my entire lifetime, for an incredibly long time. And yet, in my lifetime, since the 1980s and 90s, we've gone from Atkins to paleo to keto to carnivore to the transformation of words to describe basically reformatting of pretty much the same foundational diet. Maybe the fat's a little bit different, maybe there's some plants. Why create a diet with a new name? Because all of my patients are experts at failing diets. Why don't we describe what they're eating in something like a carnivore-based diet or an animal-based diet? Why do we have to create these new names for all these diets that can then become targets?
So the carnivore diet, even though it's much better than the standard recommended diet, doesn't make eating offal compulsory, and there's no stipulation about how much fat and protein you eat. So you could be eating too much protein, and that might take you out of ketosis, whereas the sapiens diet has the correct proportions of fat and protein, which is roughly 2 to 1, to keep you in ketosis. You could call it the evolutionary diet.
So we've already got another word, the proper human diet, which is Ken Berry's diet. But yeah, I understand the explanation behind the name, but to my mind, there should be a consensus word that we use for a diet that opposes vegetarianism and veganism. You've got basically plant-based versus animal-based and various formulations within those arenas. And then the omnicarnivorous diet, which is a hybrid of the two to a certain extent.
Should we invent one now, or what would
well,
you?
no, I'm just asking that question because
That's a good
you do
point.
focus heavily on the sapiens diet. And again, I told you I was going to be more like the British Parliament. When you take off your shoe like Khrushchev did in our parliament and bangs it on the door, then on the desk, then we'll have a disagreement. But it's important that we do ask these difficult questions. And I understand the concept, but also from a pragmatic application perspective, it imposes limitations, as opposed to broadens what we're able to eat within that. And I'll give you the argument against the offal. Here in the US, people eat hamburgers. So the concept of eating offal, unless you put it in a little capsule and you buy it, is a concern. What you're talking about is micronutrients in the diet.
Yes.
And so Ali, for example, and I think we've also, there's a little bit of bias here toward land-based animal products. Stephen Cunane, who's a brilliant researcher from Canada, has written quite a bit about where we evolved as Homo sapiens. And we talk about the plains, but he uses the concept of shoreline evolution, that human beings had the most reliable sources of food from shorelines, where we had access to marine foods and we had access to crops and we had access to animals that came down to that water, whether it was fresh water or seawater. Ali, would you agree that marine products are a vital component of a proper human diet, or would you disagree with that?
I eat fish, especially the oily fishes, and I can't eat out shellfish because I'm allergic to those, but so that, they're not for everyone. But I don't think we have to. And yes, I agree that with Stephen Cunane's idea that a lot of where people have lived around coastal regions and they've had access to fish, that has given them the source of animal foods, which is rich in nutrients. So those have been beneficial. But also, you had the migrations of Homo sapiens out of Europe into Eurasia, central landlocked areas, and what enabled humans to do this, to migrate all over the world, was following large herbivores and hunting and eating them in very unhospitable areas where you couldn't eat plant foods. For instance, I worked in Mongolia. Their diet is almost entirely, or traditionally their diet was entirely based on meat and also from dairy products. And now that they're eating a lot of carbohydrates and things as well, their health has declined. You've also got, the Inuit population who, when following their natural diet, which would include not only fish, but also seal and whale meat and large herbivores in the summertime, hunting those. On that indigenous diet, they were extremely healthy, and it's only been since the coming of Western diets flown into those communities that they've become diabetic and obese and fat at the same rate as the rest of us. So I don't regard it as absolutely essential to eat fish.
Right.
From an evolutionary point of view, from what I've read, fish wasn't a regular part of the human diet until 40 to 60,000 years ago. And if you look at the return on calories from various types of food acquisition, it's large herbivores that give the largest return compared to small game and fishing. And in terms of the DHA content of different foods, the brain of herbivores actually has the highest DHA content. As far as I know, Stephen Cunane's part of his argument is about DHA in fish, but actually it's the brain of herbivores that have the largest amounts of DHA, even compared to fish.
I think that's a very reasonable statement, is that the 3 and the 6s are the only essential fatty acids. However, when you talk about offal, or you talk about the foods in the guts, a lot of the big carnivores tend to eat that first. But in the modern era, which we have to respect, is that we are currently people driving cars, wearing clothes, living in houses. The concept of eating offal doesn't appeal to a lot of people.
We have to change that.
Well, we can either change it or we can adapt to it. What you're talking about with offal is the micronutrient value. But can you not get the same micronutrient value from dairy? And I want to know how you feel about dairy, from small fish, your oysters, your clams, your mussels, your whole fish, like the sardines, that type of thing, or from eggs. I mean, eggs and dairy are the whole animal, that by definition either feed the whole animal dairy or become the whole animal, as in an egg. Is that not adequate if you're not going to eat offal? In other words, you're getting what you need from that. How do you feel about dairy as a food source?
Yes, you can get all the nutrients that you need if you include dairy and eggs in your diet. But we argue that most dairy farming is intensive and very bad for the environment, as is fishing. It's destroying the marine ecosystem, whereas getting your nutrients,
egg production.
Yeah.
You know, egg production, chicken farming is, in terms of welfare and of the animal, and also the damage to land, is significant. You know, so I would argue that if you're trying to decide your diet on ethical grounds in terms of animal welfare and the impacts on the environment, then eating beef and lamb is much more ethical than eating eggs and dairy. You can, of course, rear dairy cattle at pasture without grains, although most of it isn't because of the market economics. And you can...
But to come back to your question about the nutrition from dairy, so dairy milk is known to be insulinogenic, which is that it raises your insulin level abnormally, and much more so than other foods, than meat does. And the Hungarian research group, they find that it's the milk proteins that cause problems in their patients with autoimmune diseases. So probably many people are fine with some amounts of dairy in their diet, but it's not ideal, even though it can provide all the micronutrients that you need.
So I would argue with you that that is an illogical argument, because we do not exist as a species without dairy. So suddenly, after the first 1 to 2 years of life, we become allergic to dairy, or dairy becomes the thing that gave us life, that most adequately sustained us, our brains and the rest of our growth, suddenly becomes abnormal. Secondly, almost all formulations of diet are based on the constituents of dairy. And yet we abandon what's in dairy to formulate modern human diets. I do want to move on from dairy, but that is an argument that I strongly make, is the pro-dairy. Well, let me ask you this question. Is a carnivore diet, is a pure animal product diet, whether it's a sapiens diet, with any formulation, is that an adequate diet long term?
Yes.
How long?
Definitely. long-term in terms of health and life, or for the planet?
Well, I'm going to make an argument against that. And as a physician, I have proof of this. And I think these are important concepts to discuss. You mentioned earlier on, and this is where the biggest disagreement between you and I comes from, is that dairy is insulinergic. And you consider that to be bad. Well, a carnivore diet is described over time, and I've got thousands of patients to prove this, and I've got the evidence from their blood work. Insulin suppression, where you are living on such a high-fat diet that you're not producing insulin. And I'm not talking about insulin's use in terms of clearing sugar, well, that's a piece of it. But insulin it's a quarterback hormone, a central hormone to the entire metabolic system, from cancer regulation to cholesterol production to a variety of other functions. And what we see on a carnivore diet over a long period of time is insulin suppression, where you are not releasing insulin, and insulin is not released in response to blood sugar, which was the previous concept that I grew up with. Insulin requires the triggering of GLP-1, and the only thing that really triggers GLP-1 are carbohydrates. So one of the concerns we see in our patients who have been on a carnivore diet for a very long time, we start to see certain elements that we consider to be negative going up. Their A1C goes up, their triglycerides go up, their blood sugars go up. Now, to what degree that causes harm, to what degree that causes inflammation, we don't yet know, but we consider those to be concerning metrics, as is cancer regulation, as is brain repair, brain growth. So insulin suppression is a big concern for me, and it's measurable on an oral glucose tolerance test. It almost looks like a type 1 diabetic. So we have the discussive argument between people like Anthony Chaffee, who obviously everybody knows, and I think Anthony is wonderful as a bastion for what we're doing. I don't disagree with either of these folks. And then kind of polar opposite, but in the same space, we've got Paul Saladino, who's eating 300-400 grams of carbohydrates in fruit and in some vegetables and in honey, whereas he was in 2020 pure carnivore. How do you reconcile the production and release of insulin long term on a carnivore diet?
So after how many years of following a carnivore diet do you see this insulin suppression?
Depends on what you started with, because there's first a therapeutic component for people that are ill, but anywhere from 2 to 5 to 7 years. The other person that also pointed this out, and I think it's probably the single most brilliant paper or research that we've ever seen in the ketogenic space, is a woman by the name of Isabella Cooper. She spearheads a group out of Oxford. She's a Ph.D. student in Oxford. And she did some brilliant research where she looked at a group of long-standing fat-adapted ketogenic women, all under the age of 50, premenopausal. And they were all consuming around 50 to 100 grams of carbohydrates, yet remaining in fat-adapted ketosis. But the principle of that was to trigger insulin. And the adaptability of those women was enormous. So those are two arenas, and certainly clinically where I work with a lot of carnivores, including people like Sean Baker. And Sean's A1C crept up, his weight crept up, he's made modifications to bring that back. So we do see this, and I don't think we should be blind to it, but certainly as a strategy, carnivore, the type of diet you're proposing, is the healthiest diet to most rapidly correct disease. But I believe that carnivore is a diet that is a strategy that fits within a broader range of food for two reasons. The first reason is the biology, but the second reason is the sustainability for most people. And comment on, I assume that all three of you are following this diet. Can you comment how long you've been on it for, and what your experiences have been and what your concerns are?
I've been on it for about 7 years. I've had all positive experiences. Now I keep to it roughly 80% of my diet. I have to confess that I don't do it 100%. When I first took up the diet, I did something called a leaky gut test on myself. It's a PEG 400 test. before and after. For the first 4 weeks, I stuck to the diet religiously. And what I found was that my leaky gut reversed. But more than that, I had something called acanthosis nigricans, which is abnormal pigmentation, which doesn't sound bad of itself, but it's can be a marker of insulin resistance, which I think I had. So that went away almost completely within a couple of months of following the diet. I also had other vague skin issues. I had eczema and dermographism. Those got better. I wasn't overweight, but my weight did drop a little bit. And bizarrely, I found a few of my gray hairs started going back to black. I don't know whether that's coincidence, but it happened and it continues to happen.
But it's interesting that you have broadened the range of food that you are eating, which is exactly, again, it's not a criticism, it's just a conceptual change over time. What about you, Dave?
Yeah, for me, I've been doing this now for about 3 years. And before that, until then, I'd been following more or less paying attention to the national food guidelines, 5 a day of fruit and veg, eating lots of whole grains and cereals and stuff. A typical breakfast for me would have been cereal with a sprinkling of berries on top. A typical lunch would have been, wholemeal bread, sandwiches, and so on. I think it was just, I think I was beginning to realize it was disagreeing with me inside. Maybe I was getting gluten intolerant. I followed Anita's advice. I switched from cereals in the morning to a more traditional British breakfast, sausages, eggs, bacon, and so on. And it almost immediately, my guts, my stomach, etc., really settled down. And I lost 2 inches around the waist. So in about the first 6 months, I reduced my waist size by 2 inches. Like Anita, yeah, it's interesting. Do you keep to it 100%, or do you broaden your range? One way I think we put it in the book is that modern food guidelines describe carbs as being a staple of your diet. We would say they're not a staple; they should be a treat. So if it's Christmas,
now, I'm going to argue with you there. It depends on who you are.
Whatever.
There's no way on God's earth I would do that, because once I start, I can't stop. I'm like an alcoholic when it comes to carbohydrates. So that's the
a treat. But it is easy. But it is no. I disagree, because I thought I'd never be able to give up my morning croissant. I'd have a croissant every morning. I mean, it's another aspect of a carb-rich diet. Is it leaves you feeling hungry for snacks mid-morning, mid-afternoon, late at night. I, for one, have managed to stop that.
Where is that? A snack is always an emotional event.
Yeah, so it's not just, it's part of, going out and eating out and so on.
Ali and I can't eat just one chocolate, unfortunately.
I think you and I are in the same thing. I would argue with you, Anita, is that you are what I would call a TOFI, genetically more diabesogenic with the acanthosis nigricans. And the argument is I become fat very easily because my body is really good at turning sugar into fat. You probably couldn't, because your blood sugar would rise too quickly. And that's the diabesogenic part of its heritage, genetic heritage, whereas you got the bell curve toward obesogenicity. That's discussion for another day. But what about you, Ali? Are you religious about this diet, or?
So I've been doing the diet for about 4 years. Before that, I was on a ketogenic diet, but sort of Mediterranean style ketogenic diet for about 6 months before. And I'd started to lose weight. I've lost a lot of weight this way. When I cut out the plant foods, and initially I did the diet very strictly, cut out dairy as well, which was really tough for me. And what happened was, within a very short space of time, a lot of problems resolved. So I'd had a skin condition called rosacea, for 20 years, and nothing had resolved it. And it just went away within 2 weeks when I went on this diet, even though I'd been ketogenic for 6 months before. The other thing was that I'd been diagnosed with Barrett's esophagus, where the cells lining the esophagus are changing, and there's a risk that that can lead to esophageal cancer. So I was diagnosed with that just before I went on to the diet. And I'd been told that I had to take omeprazole, a proton pump inhibitor, every day for the rest of my life. And I knew that wasn't a good idea. So I went on to the diet, and as I say, within a short time, the rosacea resolved. And also overnight, the symptoms of acid reflux, which I'd had, linked with the Barrett's for years, just disappeared. And so I didn't take the omeprazole. And 2 years later, when I had another, forgotten what you call it, where they put a camera down your throat.
Endoscopy, yeah.
Yeah. The Barrett's had gone. And I haven't had, the only time I get symptoms of acid reflux is if I eat plant foods. The dairy is a very tough one for me. And I haven't managed to stick entirely dairy free. I've cut out a lot. I hardly ever eat cheese because I don't eat crackers any longer, or bread or anything. So, but I do still have milk in tea and cream in coffee. And the other thing was, I found that the cream was very helpful for increasing ketones, but it is quite addictive. So that in itself becomes a bit of a problem. And what has not resolved is, which I think would resolve perhaps, is that I've always suffered from eczema. And perhaps if I did cut out dairy completely, which I do try to do more and more, perhaps that would resolve.
Yeah, I think we'll leave the dairy discussion. I think there's an opposite aspect, but we're arguing within, or we're discussing within a particular group. And I think the way that I leave it is, if you believe that dairy is a problem, you can leave it out, but you've got to supplement some other form of micronutrient food of everything that's in dairy, and maybe become a bit like a vegan and start taking your C15 pills and that kind of thing. I just threw that one in there. The last question I have for you, and today's a very pertinent day, and I'm not going political on this, but there is a sizable pivot in the US today. Today's the 20th of November. It is the inauguration of what I'm hoping will be a transformative element, not in politics, but in our healthcare system here in the US. One of the fattest, one of the sickest countries in the world, despite by far the greatest spenders on healthcare, on reactive healthcare. Robert Kennedy Jr. has been tapped to head up what's called the Make America Healthy Again movement, a broad spectrum improvement in what we rely on for optimal health. So along those lines, what foundational advice, not diet to the people, but what transformations in agriculture, in where we spend subsidy money, in how we message the language, the intent, how can you guys each come up with a couple of points that you would make at a governmental populational directive that he can begin to implement?
Well, my two headline points would be to penalize intensive farming and to subsidize pasture-reared and regenerative farming. That's the farming that's best for the environment and best for human health too. In a nutshell,
is it adequate? Is it adequate? Do you believe that there's an adequate ability to produce bovine animals without feeding them crops?
I'll let Ali answer that.
Yeah. Yes, I think so. You know, in Britain, for instance, and many parts of the world, yes, conventional beef production is mostly, you know, our standard beef production from suckler cattle is mainly from pasture. In the finishing period, on a conventional system, you'd be feeding a small amount of grains with silage, that sort of thing. So actually the inputs are the lowest, and the impacts in terms of the environment are the lowest of any food, even on that conventional system. If you make that organic or even regenerative, the benefits are higher. Much of the land in the world, in Britain and all around the world, is what we call marginal land. It's land that cannot be cropped. And a lot of it is in grassland, range grasslands or pasture grasslands, which are extremely valuable for carbon sequestration and also for other services, ecosystem services that they provide to us in terms of biodiversity and habitat management. So these grazing animals and grasslands are extremely important. And what we see is that when you convert grassland to arable land, you lose massive amounts of carbon and you eradicate the habitat and the biodiversity. So we've seen since 2017, there have been a number of major studies, long-term studies from Germany, from Britain and elsewhere, showing an 80% decline in winged insects, flying insects. Also the decline in earthworms. This is all coming from the use of pesticides and agrochemicals in arable farming. So we can't, it isn't sustainable to go to convert grasslands to arable. We have to go the other way. And if we want to keep using what the Sustainable Food Trust in this country produced a paper a couple of years ago suggesting that we should reduce the amount of grains that we grow, we should reduce the amount of sugar beet that we grow, and we should reduce the amounts of oil seeds that we grow. We don't have to produce, you know, most of the most intensive and damaging grain-fed animals are not ruminants, they're pigs and poultry. And it's that intensive livestock that is most harmful in terms of the welfare and the impacts on the environment. So we should be converting arable land back to grassland, either by putting it into rotations to produce fruit and vegetables, and reducing the amount of grains and oil seeds and sugar that we're producing.
But I think, Alisa, you said a very good, you made it, which is kind of combines with Ali's points here, is that the transformation in governmental thinking is a change in subsidy focus away from massive plant subsidies or crop subsidies toward what we call in this country ranching, which is animal farming, towards subsidizing animal farming. And by changing that incentive, by changing the economics of how you support those farmers, you're automatically going to create a transformation in the focus of the form of agriculture or ranching that we do. So I like that point. That's one of the things that I'm very in favor of, is changing our subsidies. And then also from Dave, I want to hear your point, but as a fossil fuel guy here in the US 20 years ago, we became very interested in biofuels. And a large part of the crops are still biofuel based. When you go to the garage or the gas station in this country, there's a certain blend of ethanol and of biofuels that still exists in our petrol, in our gasoline in this country. And there's no need, in my opinion, to subsidize and produce biofuels.
I'm not sure. Ali, I think Ali might be better to answer this question.
Well, the biofuels can be very harmful. For starting, you know, they're taking up land that could be producing food directly for humans. and they're still producing emissions, and they're still causing soil damage.
But when you look at the crops in the US, a large fraction of those go toward animal feeds as well as biofuel. But Dave, what advice would you give to the US in terms of transforming our focus, our governmental
Well, I
focus
think
on healthcare?
It is an opportunity to, I mean, I think the exciting bit is they're going to challenge all the conventional thinking. And we've touched on the conventional thinking about farming is one area, but also challenging the conventional thinking about the food guidelines. So as well as the policies that we've just talked about in terms of, if you're going to interfere with the market, have policies that encourage sustainable farming and discourage unsustainable agrochemical intensive farming. Likewise, the food is have policies that make food that is grown organically or sustainably, whether it's organic crop farming or, as we would prefer, pasture-fed farming, is if you're going to interfere with the subsidies on that, make that farming affordable. It should be, the cheapness of carbohydrates and of processed foods in supermarkets is one of the reasons why people buy them, and the convenience, of course. It should be the other way around.
Mm.
I think the thing that drove that initially,
Tax on carbohydrates.
Sorry?
Put a tax on carbohydrates.
Well, I've always argued for that, and I think that is a
carbs.
very important concept. But the thing that drove this way back in the 1970s, 60s, and 70s was, from my research, tobacco producer-induced lipophobia to distract from the harm of tobacco, and particularly the cardiovascular and pulmonary harm. And I think reversing lipophobia at a societal level is a crucial, a fundamental guideline change that we can make. Lipophobia being the fear of fat, that fat causes harm and that sugar and starch is okay. And even this concept that diabetes is caused by eating fat rather than eating sugar and starch.
I don't know whether you've come across the bit in the book where we suggest treating carbohydrates like tobacco, that they should come with a health warning.
Yes, no, I agree completely. And I think particularly the processed carbohydrates or the manufactured carbohydrates, as well as the seed oils, into that category. But I think reversing the negative focus on lipophobia that we all grew up with, unless you were born pre the mid-60s, that's been our experience.
What do you mean? I'm not sure I've heard that term.
Lipophobia is the fear of fat.
Fear of fat.
Yeah.
No,
I'd like to see a day. I'd like to see a day where in the supermarket, instead of the healthy shelf being the low-fat shelf, with reduced fat this, low fat this, and so on, and of course what replaces it? More carbs, which makes you more prone to become overweight. It should be the other way around. Wouldn't it be nice to have the health shelf, which is high fat but low carb, the low carb shelf? The low carb.
And we also need to do this in our farming as well, because a massive change that I've seen in my working life is that in Britain, we've moved away from our native breeds of cattle like the Hereford and not so much the Angus, because that has sort of quality value, but our native breeds are slow growing and they tend to get fat. And we've changed over to European breeds of cattle, which are lean, and it's all been driven by the diet heart hypothesis, which we now know is completely wrong. Plus the fact that they grow more, but they need more grains to finish in the end. So we need to reverse that thinking as well. And also farmers get penalized if they send cattle to market to the slaughterhouse which are over fat. We should stop that. And they trim off a massive amount of fat at the abattoir because we've all been told it's so harmful. And when you go to the supermarket, if you look at steaks, they're marked with a red traffic light warning, you know, high in saturated fat, even though they've trimmed off so much of it.
And that's the lipophobia argument that
Yeah.
is as I said, a tobacco industry narrative rather than a nutritional health-based narrative. And I think that shift is such an important shift. The other shift that I'd like to see is away from I understand the value of it at a population level, but there's no reason we can't be a bit more European, where they've got small mom and pop shops selling foods. You can go into a store in France and all it sells is sardines. Here in the US, it's all about these huge, massive, multiple football field stores that you can buy everything in, that is easy and provides commercial shopping, but more and more promoting and subsidizing the small mom and pop farmers that can then collectively deliver food to which is the big trend here in the US, is no longer going to the shop to buy or the store to buy food, but having it delivered by some drone or by some other mechanism. Well, whether you buy from a small farmer or from a large store, we should be able to subsidize the delivery of those foods from the small farmer. But those are all transformations, but ultimately it requires a massive transformation in thinking that fat is okay and that eating animals is okay intellectually, from an animal rights perspective, and from a human health perspective. Any other specific comments or points that you would like to raise that I haven't covered? I haven't gone through all my notes. I mean, I've got notes from when I was reading the book, but any other important points that you would like to bring to the attention of people, that nobody's going to watch this that is antagonistic to what we're talking about? This is going to be watched by people who are conflicted, either following a particular eating pattern or conflicted between the governmental messaging and the volume of messaging out there versus what we have to say. And any other messages or thoughts from your research, from your book, that you would like to point out?
I would just reinforce what we've already said, that if you look at our evolution, it suggests we should be eating animal-based foods rather than a high amount of plant foods. But if you also look at the way that to be sustainable for the planet, to be healthy for the planet, that also suggests we should be farming for animal foods rather than farming. So my conclusion would be that what we are proposing is good for health and good for the planet.
I would add about the ethics of killing meat, killing animals to eat meat. What many people don't realize is that we kill far more animals to grow crops. Huge numbers of birds, small mammals, deer are killed in this country and all over the world to protect crops, and many more lives are lost than when you slaughter one beef animal in order to eat beef. And on from that is the impact on our insect life and arthropods all over. So a lot of people are talking about the fact that we don't see the bugs on our windscreens in summertime anymore, and people are worried about this, and people have this idea that pesticides are bad. What they don't realize is that those pesticides are almost entirely used in arable crop farming, not in grazing livestock farming or on grasslands. So it's the grazing livestock and grassland farming that is really beneficial for wildlife and the environment and for us.
I would agree wholeheartedly with that sentiment. The biggest challenge is that if you ask any child under the age of 8 where food comes from, it comes from a shop, a store, and it's packaged in cellophane and styrofoam, and they have no connection with what you just said. I think that it's remiss on us to be able to expose that aspect of agriculture, because you can see the animal that is the meat, but you don't see what you just talked about when you're buying some Brussels sprouts or broccoli.
My parting shot would be to women who are planning a family to please read the book, because you can choose your diet as you like as an adult, but it's so important for babies, infants, and young children to have the right diet, and they have no choice because they have to follow what their parents give them.
There is no question. And when it comes back to the brain, which is a large part of the title of this book and the content of the book, the brain is formed from two perspectives. Number one, the nutrition that we provide as a substrate for the brain, but also the only way to raise a child is to be the person you want them to be. Children emulate our behavior, and there's both a cultural aspect as well as a biologic and nutritional aspect to raising the healthiest child you can, because we're looking at potentially 80 years of life within that child, and the first year or two matters the most. So I really appreciate that sentiment. And thank you all so much. Thank you for producing this wonderful book. I mean, it is absolutely an incredible read. It's a poke in the eye by title, but then you support the title with facts and with arguments rather than with criticism and emotions. And that for me is so important as a counter argument, that you can come with your opinions all day long. You and I can have different opinions, but ultimately there's only one set of facts. And that's in the book.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rob.
Thank you. Thanks very much.
Thanks very much.
Good to talk to you.